Okay, so today I wanted to go over the basics of nutrition. There's so many myths out there, and so I wanted to hopefully with this presentation give you a basic understanding of the macronutrients and nutrition, so that way that when you do see something that kind of seems a little bit iffy, you understand if it's true or not. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna start the PowerPoint. If you are watching this recorded and have any questions, please feel free to DM me if you have any specific questions, or maybe you want to address any sort of myths you may have heard and you're wondering if they're true or not. So first, we're going to go over each of the macronutrients, which are carbohydrates, protein, and fat. So those are the main macronutrients. So let's talk about carbohydrates. What have you heard about them? Like any myths you may have heard? Maybe carbs cause you to gain weight, right? Maybe low carb diets are the best way to lose weight, or you shouldn't eat carbs at night. So hopefully, as I discuss carbohydrates, you get a better understanding of what they are and why these things you may have heard are not true. So what are carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are basically compounds made of single or multiple sugar units, and they come from plants via photosynthesis. So what are the functions of carbohydrates? They provide energy. So they are the body's main form of energy. So let's say you're going to go and work out, having some sort of quick carb source is going to help fuel your workout, because your body is using those carbohydrates as energy. So something like a banana, maybe some oatmeal before you work out to help fuel your workouts. It helps add bulk to foods. It also helps with energy storage, and it helps spare a muscle. So there's different types of carbohydrates, and they're mainly split into two different categories, simple and complex. So simple is broken down further into monosaccharides and disaccharides. So monosaccharides, here's a good graphic for your reference, but monosaccharides include glucose, fructose, and galactose. So mono means one, so the monosaccharides mean it's composed of one sugar unit. And then you also have the disaccharides, di meaning two, so that means containing two sugar units. So that includes maltose, lactose, and sucrose. All right, and then you have the complex carbohydrates, which are the polysaccharides, poly meaning many. And so that is broken down to starches, fibers, and glycogen, okay? So let's starting with the monosaccharides. They contain one sugar unit, glucose, fructose, and galactose. Fructose is fruit sugar. So think of like your bananas, your peaches, and honey. Glucose is known as blood sugar, and then galactose is the sugar in milk. So milk does have sugar in it, okay? Keep in mind that these are directly absorbed into the bloodstream. So when you consume sugar, your body basically breaks all the sugar down into monosaccharides. It breaks them down into the simplest form of sugar, which is the monosaccharides, if that makes sense. Then you have the disaccharides. So the disaccharides are made up of the monosaccharides. They contain two sugar units. Sucrose is commonly known as table sugar. You got lactose, the milk sugar, and then you have maltose or malt sugar, which appears when starch is broken down. Again, like I said earlier, these disaccharides are broken down into the monosaccharides to then be absorbed into the body and into the bloodstream. Then you have the polysaccharides made of multiple sugar units, so the starches, fiber, glycogen. Starch is the plant storage form of glucose. It can be converted to glucose in humans. This includes like potatoes, any sort of grains, stuff like that. And then you have glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose in humans and in animals. And then fiber, which you've probably heard of, is the digestible parts of plants. So let's talk about polysaccharides, more specifically fiber. Fiber is basically the human digestive enzymes cannot break down fiber. And there's two different types of fiber. There's soluble, which means it dissolves in water, and there's insoluble, which does not dissolve in water. Fiber is super important because even though the body cannot break it down, it's super important for maintaining a healthy colon and helping with inflammation, helping with health concerns like decreasing low blood cholesterol. And then research does indicate that a diet rich in fiber is going to help protect against heart diseases and strokes. And again, it may also reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes. So even though fiber, your body cannot technically break down fiber, it's a really good for in terms of prevention, in terms of health diseases. Now let's talk about the digestion of carbohydrates. So like I said earlier, most are broken down to glucose, but only fiber and resistant starch pass through the small intestine into the colon. Keeping in mind, so talking about when people say, oh, I'm going low carb, or low carb is good for you, keep in mind that without glucose, the body is forced to use protein as fat as energy. So if you're compensating for carbohydrates in your body's is smart, and it's gonna compensate in other ways. It's gonna use protein and fat as energy, which is not ideal. Okay, remember, glucose is your body's main form of energy. So protein is broken down and is used to fuel the brain, and fat is broken down to ketones, which can lead to ketosis. Okay, nothing wrong if you're going low carb. But again, if you're going low carb, doing it for the right reasons, there is research to indicate that it may help with certain diseases. It may help with stroke. It may help with individuals with type 2 diabetes, right? So, if you do go low carb, just be careful. Obviously, I'd advise you talking to a dietitian or some sort of healthcare professional before going low carb. And then thinking about in the long term, if going low carb is something you can sustain throughout your entire life. So the recommendations for carbs is around 45 to 65% of your total daily calories. In terms of fiber, remember, fiber is super important. For females, you should get around 25 grams of fiber per day. And for males, 38 grams of fiber per day. Keep in mind that when you do intake high amounts of fiber, it may cause some discomfort. So just keep that in mind if you do increase your fiber, to do so in slow and small doses, because you don't want to do that too quickly, because you just don't want to have an upset stomach. Okay, so now let's talk about protein. What have you heard about protein? Maybe protein only comes from meat. Maybe your body can only absorb a certain amount of protein, et cetera, et cetera. But what is protein? Protein is basically made up of amino acids, which is the building blocks of protein. And there's two different types of amino acids, essential and non-essential amino acids, which I'll explain in the next slide. Interesting fact is that protein does have the highest thermic effect of food. What does this mean is that your body, compared to digesting carbohydrates and fat, protein tends to burn more energy compared to protein into fat in terms of digestion. So there's essential and non-essential amino acids. Essential meaning that you need to get these from your diet. Non-essential meaning that your body produces these amino acids. So what are different functions of protein? Obviously, it helps to build muscle, and also helps to transport substances in the body, helps to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance, and also plays a role during blood clotting as well. Let's talk real quickly about supplements, because I always get asked like what supplements you should be using, if you need to take protein powder. Just a general rule, supplements are not regulated by the FDA. So keep that in mind. So if you are consuming supplements, I would look into seeing if the supplement company is third-party tested. Because there are some companies that are known to have heavy metals in their protein supplements. So keep that in mind. And then let's talk about BCAAs. So BCAAs are branched chain amino acids. You probably have heard of these, but if you're consuming enough protein from adequate sources, you don't necessarily need any more amino acids. Um, Again, remember we talked about non-essential and essential amino acids. If you're having enough protein and you're eating enough, if you eat a lot of meat or eating enough protein in your diet, you should be getting all of your amino acid profile. Okay. You don't necessarily need amino acids. And there's different types of protein powders. The one that you choose is the one that you prefer. So whey is the most common. It contains all amino acids. It is easily digested. Casein, similar to whey, but it's longer digesting. So it's going to keep you full longer. Keep in mind that whey and casein come from milk. So if you're lactose intolerant, I wouldn't recommend having some whey or casein. But then there's soy, which is a vegan alternative, which is also great. One brand that I really love their protein powders is P Science. The only reason why is because I trust this company and I know their research base. So I know that what they say they have and ingredients they have in their supplements is what it says on the label, and there's not anything that's added or anything like that. So let's talk about amino acid profile. So a protein source of high quality would have basically all essential amino acids. Most of these are from animal products. So there is protein in some plant-based sources like edamame, for example, or there's like soy, for example. These are not going to have all of the amino acids. Nothing wrong with that, but you want to just make sure that you are getting all of the amino acids from different sources. Does that makes sense? And then also protein digestibility. Protein sources all vary in how you digest them. Animal sources are generally most easily digested and absorbed. So if you're vegan, then you're not going to be having meat, right, as your main protein source. So that's where complementary proteins come in. So basically, it's just combining a different plant sources so that you're getting all of your essential amino acids, right? So remember how I said that plant-based sources don't have all of the amino acids. So basically, you would just combine different sources so that way they complement each other. That makes sense, right? So some example would be kind of like beans and rice, or any sort of grain with legumes. Let's talk a little bit also about gluten-free. Gluten is basically a protein that forms in grains. Individuals with celiacs or they have some sort of gluten sensitivity, tend to experience really bad chronic diarrhea and other really uncomfortable symptoms. There's no evidence that going gluten-free, helps with, disease prevention in terms of obesity, cancer, or anything else. Just keep in mind, if you do go gluten-free, why you're doing it. Personally, I wouldn't recommend it unless you have celiac or you have some sort of gluten sensitivity. But also keeping in mind that foods that are gluten-free do tend to be higher in calories, added sugars, and calories. Oh, and fats, I'm sorry. I don't know if I've heard this several times, but maybe that your body can only absorb a certain amount of protein. Like for example, you could only absorb 20 to 25 grams of protein per meal. Well, I did my research and based on a literature review by Dr. Schoenfeld, this is actually not true. What matters the most is your overall calorie and your protein intake, not necessarily the timing or the amount of the protein that you're intaking. Here are some examples, right? So there's animal products like obviously beef, chicken, eggs, there's protein powders, grains, quinoa has tons of protein in there. Veggies like edamame, and then obviously there's like soy products as well. So these are the recommendations basically 10 to 30% of total daily calories. So keep in mind this 10 to 30% of total daily calories is just for base, like it's just the minimum you should be intaking, if that makes sense. If you're trying to build muscle, you should be consuming a little bit more. Ideally, based on research, having at least 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight is recommended to build muscle. Okay. So let's take me, for example. I weigh roughly 120. Let's times that by 0.8. So I should be consuming minimum like 96 grams to 120 grams of protein per day if my goal were to build muscle. All right, so lastly, let's talk about fats. What are some things you have heard? Maybe you need to eat low-fat diets. Maybe consuming fat can lead to fat gain. Well, what is fat? Fat is basically made up of fatty acids, and they include different types: triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. So fat is super, super important. It helps transfer fat-soluble vitamins throughout your body, helps with protecting your organs, helps with your hormones as well. Women who go low fat, may have some sort of hormone imbalances going on. And fat can be used as a fuel if needed. So let's talk about triglycerides. Triglycerides are basically, as you see in the picture, 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule. Glycerol can be converted into glucose if needed for energy. So let's say, for example, you're going low carb, then you might use the glycerol as energy. It might convert to glucose for energy. These include saturated fats, which contain no double bond and are solid at room temperature. So think of butter, think of lard. And then there's also unsaturated fats, the monounsaturated and the polyunsaturated fats. Let's talk, and then there's phospholipids. So phospholipids play a role in keeping fat spread in water. So keep in mind that fat does not dissolve in water. So phospholipids help with keeping fat spread in the water since it cannot be dissolved in it. It also helps fats travel through the lipid membranes of cells. They include very low density lipoproteins, which help transport fats to the body cells. Low density lipoproteins helps transport cholesterol and other lipids to tissues, and then high density lipoprotein, which helps picks up cholesterol and carries it away. So that was a lot, right? So the phospholipids include the lipoproteins, which is, if you get like lab results, this is what they would test for. So ideally, the LDL, the low density lipoproteins, you want to keep low. Okay, and then the HDL, which is the high density lipoproteins, you want to keep high. So if you have high LDLs, so keep in mind you want to keep these low. You want to make sure, so in order to have low LDLs and keeping those HDLs high, what do? Just making sure you're eating a well-balanced diet and exercise. Exercise has been proven to help with the lipoproteins and keeping the HDLs high. So this is why it's important to strength train and work out. And sterols. So sterols are also known as cholesterol. They help. So cholesterol, I think some people have a bad, I guess, idea of it, but it's actually really helpful because it helps with the structure of cell membranes. It can be made by the body, and it helps make vitamin D, bile, and sex hormones. Obviously, when it comes an issue is when there's too much cholesterol in the blood. So what are the recommendations? So recommended is between 20 to 35% of total daily calories. Saturated fats. So saturated fats, again, is like the butter, the lard, coconut oil, all those things. You want to limit those, keep those less than 10% of total daily calories. And then cholesterol, you want to keep less than 300 milligrams per day. Keep in mind, these are just general recommendations, right? And then lastly, here is a quote by my nutrition professor. She would always say, variety is the spice of life. So I really hope this presentation was helpful. If you're watching this recorded, if it went super fast, I apologize. You can go ahead, slow it down, take notes as needed. And then if you have any questions, feel free to email me, message me on Instagram, or if you're kind of mine, you can just DM me on Train Eyes. I hope you guys all have a wonderful, wonderful day today.